Next, we're going to be joined by Dr. Gabrielle Gergis. Gabby is a new colleague of mine at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where she is one of our inaugural postdoctoral fellows. And that postdoctoral part means that she has recently successfully completed her doctoral degree at Princeton University, where she wrote her dissertation on the philosophical foundations of American religious liberty law and why religious liberty deserves to have special constitutional protection. Gabby was an undergrad at Notre Dame, did her PhD at Princeton, and now she's a postdoc at EPPC. She's going to be focusing on the religious liberty implications for the Equality Act, especially as applied to abortion and conscience. Thank you, Gabby.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you also to Sister Joy and to Amy McInerney and the other organizers of tonight's event. It's really a joy and an honor for me to be able to speak to you, especially alongside such senior and more established colleagues. I'm actually going to start on a note, similar notes to Mary, and just preface what I'm going to say tonight about the religious liberty implications of the Equality Act with an appeal to some of the younger people who might be listening to this and who are feeling on the fence about opposing the Equality Act, which at least in name sounds like a law that everyone should be willing to support. And what I would say to you is that, just as Mary said, and as Ryan said at the beginning, it's always right to oppose unjust discrimination against people who are equal in dignity to everyone else and who need our compassion and our love. The Catechism tells us that. And no one here is in favor of unjust discrimination against people who identify as gay or trans or against anyone else. But the Equality Act, as I'll talk about and as others are emphasizing tonight, sweeps far more broadly than that. And much of its effect will be not to help people in need, but to do harm to legitimate freedoms of association, expression, and religion, freedoms that have been protected from the founding of our country and are written into our very Constitution. And those are what I want to talk to you about tonight. And what I will say will have two parts. First, I'm going to talk briefly about why the Equality Act is so overbroad and really extreme from a religious liberty standpoint. And then second, I'll talk about some of the ways that the Equality Act might affect you day to day and the way that you exercise your religious liberty, and with particular attention to the issue of abortion. So first, what makes this law so overbroad? The Equality Act is a radical piece of legislation in two ways, both in the scope of the issues that it covers and in the breadth of the application that it will have. First, on the scope, I think the best way to think about the Equality Act is as one giant law that covers many of the religious liberty challenges that we've seen in the last decade. Challenges, say, for example, to bakers, artists, florists, photographers who have been forced to serve same-sex weddings, religious business owners who've been forced to provide insurance coverage for contraceptives that cause early abortion, religious adoption or foster care agencies that have been unwilling to certify same-sex couples as potential foster parents or adoptive parents because they believe that children deserve a mother and a father. The Equality Act says that in any of these kinds of cases, we can no longer claim a religious liberty defense. And it does that, as Ryan and Robert have mentioned, by explicitly prohibiting any appeal to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And I'd like to talk just briefly about RFRA, as it's called, just because it's worth knowing what this law does and why it matters so much that the Equality Act is just putting it completely under the table. RFRA passed with bipartisan support in 1993, and it's a law that requires religious exemptions from federal regulations of all kinds, unless the state has the strongest possible justification for those policies. And it has been tremendously important to religious people who have been seeking to protect their freedom to live out their vocations in the public square. But the Equality Act is the very first federal regulation to exempt itself from RFRA. It takes away our ability to appeal to RFRA in all the cases over the last decade where it's been cited before. So in that respect, it is certainly the biggest and the most aggressive effort so far to push traditional religious believers out of the public square. The Equality Act will also have the broadest application of any anti-discrimination policy so far, because it will apply all across the country in every state. And the law also drastically expands, as Robert already explained, the meaning of a public accommodation beyond the few categories of places that are covered by the original Civil Rights Act of 1964. Under the Equality Act, pretty much any public space you can think of, whether it's physical or virtual, will be a form of public accommodation, and so it'll be liable to the provisions of the law. And also, it's worth saying the Equality Act is like other federal anti-discrimination laws, and that it will apply to any entity that will receive federal funding. Now, turning to the second half of what I want to talk to you about, which are just some of the practical upshots of the Equality Act that you should be aware of, ways that it might affect you in day-to-day life. And I'll start with the issue of abortion, since I've been asked to focus on that. As others have already mentioned tonight, the Equality Act adds sexual orientation and gender identity to the protected class of sex in the Civil Rights Act. But it also expands the meaning of sex to cover pregnancy, childbirth, or a related medical condition. And under the Equality Act, all federal and state healthcare programs and any healthcare programs that receive federal funding must provide access to all treatments for the condition of pregnancy. But what's interesting to note is that federal law already bans discrimination against pregnant mothers. So what the law is really doing is, as what it really means, as pro-life leader Lila Rose has put it, is that we now have to treat the decision to end a pregnancy exactly the same as the decision to sustain a pregnancy. So, and the short of it is that if you work in the healthcare industry at all and you don't want to refer for, participate in, or perform or support an abortion in any way, which is a reasonable judgment of conscience and has been previously protected in the law, you can now be sued under the Equality Act for pregnancy discrimination. And another effect the Equality Act has in this area is that it also effectively repeals the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits federal funding or taxpayer funding of elective abortions. Other federal anti-discrimination laws have amendments clarifying that non-discrimination does not mean that you have to cover, provide, or participate in abortions. But the Equality Act noticeably lacks any amendment like that. So it will almost certainly be read to repeal the Hyde Amendment. Moving on to another area of healthcare, which is that the law will penalize any medical providers who refuse to perform gender reassignment procedures based on the reasonable and science-based judgment that those procedures are deeply harmful. It is worth reiterating, again, as Brian said at the beginning, that we don't know of a single Catholic hospital that has refused to treat a patient because he or she identifies as gay or trans. And that would be true and just discrimination, and it would be an outrage that we would all be talking about if that had happened, and rightly so. But we do know of hospitals that have refused to perform reassignment procedures or abortions, and the law just bakes in the assumption that those reasonable judgments are unjust discrimination. It just takes any discussion on that question off the table completely. Others have already talked about the religious liberty implications for public accommodations, including wedding service providers. So I will just pass on further discussion of that. But I just want to move on to the last point I would make, which is that religious institutions will certainly be subject to the provisions of this law. And it's really important to know that if your children's religious schools or colleges, if they attend those, or if you're employed by one of them, they will not be exempt from these requirements, especially if they receive any kind of federal funding. The Equality Act is going to sanction them for teaching mainstream biblical views about sex and biology, for maintaining sex-segregated facilities or sports teams or extracurricular activities, as Mary already discussed. And I think on this point, I want to take the opportunity to address another concern that some people might have, which is whether churches under this law will keep their tax-exempt status. And I'm also going to just briefly address the response that some Democratic senators have given to those who are concerned about the Equality Act, that our concerns are just scaremongering and that there isn't really going to be any change to what we believe or how we worship. So first, on the tax-exempt status of churches, this is something that's not directly addressed by the law. That's a decision for Congress and the IRS to make. But what's important to know is that the Equality Act lays the cultural foundation for that, for taking away that status, because as Ryan has already pointed out, it makes any church that teaches that we are created male and female and that male and female are created for each other the legal equivalent of racists. And years ago, the IRS took away the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University, which had banned interracial marriage among its students. And the Supreme Court then upheld that decision because on the grounds that the federal government had such a pervasive policy against racism. So there's certainly precedent in the law for taking away that status. And I think it's not unreasonable to think that would happen. And then lastly, I think it's really important to come back strong against some of you may have received letters from your Democratic senators reassuring you that your religious beliefs won't be affected or need to be changed in any way based on, if the Equality Act is passed. And their responses so far have been really disappointingly weak because they've overlooked a fundamental fact about religion, which is that religious exercise is not just a matter of belief or worship, it's about our action in the public square. Sure, this law might leave you free to believe what you want within the four walls of your house or your church, but as soon as you step out into public life and you try to live out your vocation as someone who provides many social services that religious people are motivated to offer, healthcare, education, adoption, working in soup kitchens, as soon as you do that, you will be liable to all of the provisions of the Equality Act because it extends the range of public accommodations so far, so much farther than any previous existing anti-discrimination law. And so I'll just close by driving home one final point about why this law, at least from a religious liberties perspective, is so egregious. It's unjust for many reasons, but one of the most important ones is that it bakes in a lot of assumptions, but one of the most radical assumptions is that we should all be required to shoulder the costs of one person deciding to identify as a member of the opposite sex, but we should have to shoulder none of the costs that come with living our faith publicly. The Equality Act insists on the one hand that girls can no longer have private locker rooms or female healthcare providers, while maintaining that traditional Christians can no longer be doctors, teachers, or wedding service providers. And that should truly be outrageous to all of us and worth writing to our senators about, not just because it's deeply unjust, but because religious people have always helped the state shoulder its burden of care for its citizens through all their valuable work in education and healthcare and all the other ways that we've already talked about tonight. And the state in turn has always protected that invaluable service it's always supported that and rewarded that by protecting religious liberty. And so the Equality Act just completely destroys that mutually beneficial relationship we've always had between religion and the state. And in the process, it will leave our cultural landscape completely unrecognizable. So once again, I'd really like to urge you to spread the word, to do what you can to oppose this law. And that's all I have to say. So thank you very much. And back to you, Ryan.